All right, I think we're all still filing in, but I want to say welcome to everyone. Uh, Feel free to participate in the land acknowledgement, but we are going to keep going and get started because we have a lot to cover today. I'm Amy Rohl. I'm a neo-peds hospitalist and global health educator at Cincinnati Children, and we are super excited to be here as the GHerd family with CUGH today. Special welcome to Dr. Ijeoma Opara, who's our CUGH liaison for GHerd. So today we're going to talk about a new curriculum that has been a joint project with the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Consortiums for University for Global Health, and the Association of Pediatric Program Directors. Next slide, please. This is our agenda for today. So we're going to spend about 30 minutes with a didactic about an introduction to GHerd, and then a little bit of time talking about implementation strategies for GHerd at your institution or program. And we're going to talk about foundational racial literacy and get to experience some activities from the curriculum in a small group. And then we're going to spend some time doing some self-reflection and have a little bit of a break. We're going to talk about fostering psychological safety in the second half and then do some simulated case scenarios. All right, next slide, please. All right, so in the spirit of one of sort of the foundational principles of GHerd is talking about how we center global health stories and who tells those stories. And part of that is telling a piece of our story. And so we're going to start out here in the introduction, sharing some stories and also sharing some different perspectives on the global health story. So as I mentioned, I'm Amy Rohl. I'm a white disabled American pediatrician. I grew up in the DC suburbs as a military brat and have a rare skeletal dysplasia. I traveled for care, which was a huge privilege. I met many people who shared my disability and that life experience, but had completely different experiences in terms of social inclusion and access to care. It was in those experiences as a pediatric and young adult patient that I became really interested in health equity, both locally and globally. That took me as an undergraduate to Eastern Europe, and I worked doing disability rights and early intervention development work. And when I was in Eastern Europe, I was often mistaken when I walked to work as a beggar. I would have to awkwardly explain to people that I was an American medical student. This was an extreme contrast to the unearned privileges that I was given as a medical student and resident later on in East Africa. And it was in the tension of those two different experiences that I became really interested in the intersections of anti-racism, equity, and decolonization in global health practice and scholarship. Next slide, please. So in light of that, when I was a global health fellow, I wanted to share an experience with you guys that I had. I was teaching Helping Babies Breathe at a remote hospital in Northwest Kenya, and there was this large shipping container on the lawn of this hospital, and it was filled with subspecialty surgical equipment in these boxes, as you can see here in the central photograph. These equipment were all expired, and at this point, were probably sort of rotting on the lawn because all of the subspecialty surgery patients were actually referred to another hospital about 30 miles away from this hospital. And as I stood in this very hot container, I imagined many North Americans who had potentially packed this container or donated the supplies, and I wondered about the positive affirmation or credit or even tax break that they had received for doing that. And I wondered if any of them had any idea how displaced their donations had ultimately ended up to be. And then I reflected on my own year as a global health researcher and clinician in Kenya, and I wondered at how displaced my own work was in the grand scheme, and how the story in many ways was centered around my own academic goals and not necessarily on the voices that it should be centered on in my Kenyan colleagues. So this question of who tells the global health story is kind of going to be one of our central questions that we're going to discuss today. Next slide, please. When we look at the global health literature, there are several wonderful examples of qualitative studies that really help us to listen to the unheard voices in global health education and research. I'm going to share a few excerpts. They, being the North American, either researchers or trainees, see Africa as a museum of disease. On research, we're not a part of the design, the writing, and most of the time, we don't even hear about the results. We often have problems with short-term learners talking down to our national staff. They often show up with a know-it-all attitude, and some make it clear through their actions that they're here for a glorified holiday. So clearly, and I don't think that it will come as a surprise to our CUGH audience, we have a lot of work to do in changing how we train and develop careers in global health for our trainees in global health education. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague and co-editor of GHERD, Dr. Hacknell, and she's going to share your story and a little bit about how GHERD came to be.
Hey, hello, everybody. Thank you for allowing me to also reflect on my own journey in global health, which is far from perfect. So as Amy mentioned, my name is Heather Hawk. I'm a pediatrician hospitalist based in Houston, Texas, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story and how GHERD came together. So I often describe myself as a second generation global health doctor. That woman on the top right there is my mother, who is a young family physician, was posted as a village health doctor in rural Uganda in the 1980s. And she brought her family with her. That's me in the red tights down there. So my childhood was filled with accompanying my mother on global health assignments, mostly to Uganda and later to Pakistan, where her family is originally from. As a young adult, I then saw opportunities to return to Uganda on my own, including what's sometimes referred to as voluntourism. Totally unqualified at the age of 19 or 20, I paid money for an experience to teach at a primary school in Uganda. While this chapter was highly problematic for many reasons, it set the stage for future, more meaningful engagement. I did return to Uganda to study for a year at Makerere University while I was doing my undergraduate studies, and had a remarkable experience. And then later returned to Uganda with more skills and in more meaningful and sustainable ways as a public health practitioner, and later as a pediatrician, and ended up spending 6 or 7 years in Uganda. The little girl on the right lower corner is my daughter, who is now perhaps third generation global health doctor to be, or at least a global citizen, whose worldview has been shaped by her family's involvement in global health. But my own missteps in global health has fueled my desire to change the way the next generation of learners engages in global health. And part of this change involves really reckoning with the history of our field of global health. We don't have time today to fully delve into the history of the field of global health, and I'm sure that this audience knows well. But it's so important to acknowledge that the emergence of our field of global health is inextricably enmeshed with centuries of slave trade, pilferage of resources, imperialism, and colonial conquest. The field of global health really started during imperialism. It was an effort to ensure the health and well-being of colonial officers as they established colonial rule, and then to ensure the survival of enslaved people during transatlantic slave trade, not for their well-being, but for the exploitative economic benefit. We must understand the historical and geopolitical forces that have made some regions of the world resource rich and other areas resource deprived. We must get rid of this idea that poverty and resource scarcity are the natural, immutable reality of the world, but are really reflections of our history and the legacies of colonialism, neo-colonialism, asymmetric power imbalances that continue today. So just one very brief example of a so-called pioneer in the field of global health is a Dr. Thomas Trotter, who was a Scottish Royal Navy member appointed to slave ship physician in the 1700s. He was 19 years old, had no medical experience, but was in charge of the health of enslaved people on the ship. But let's be clear, this wasn't about health equity for the enslaved. This was about capitalism and to maximize exploitative economic gain. These are the historical figures who laid the foundation for the field of global health. Yet I can assure you, most global health trainees are not aware of this history. We must acknowledge this history and reckon with it. While we often focus globally It's important to also recognize the impact of manifest destiny, colonial conquest, slavery, racist policies, and structural violence that created the marked health inequities we see within our own borders. This is part of global health as well. In around March 2020, many global health stakeholders started calling for more critical examination of the colonial roots of global health in what they called the decolonization of global health movement. Decolonization itself is not a new term, but this is kind of when it became popularized in application to global health. These calls grew louder with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement after the murder of George Floyd in May 2020. And there were international calls for closer scrutiny of the racist and colonialist practices in global health and foreign aid arenas. Academic global health then saw a marked increase in the number of scholarly publications about decolonizing global health, starting around 2020. But truth be told, academic global health was late to the conversation on decolonization. And global health education, how we educate our trainees on this topic, is far behind. Despite a sustained and high trainee interest in global health, our literature review and an ongoing needs assessment have revealed major gaps in how decoloniality is integrated into US-based global health training programs. We found that existing curricula on global health ethics addressed clinical or individual scenarios, but not systemic or historical challenges. Global health electives may offer an opportunity for transformative engagements for trainees, but also risk perpetuating the power imbalances and colonialist tendencies of our field. Currently, with many international electives on hold, we have a window of opportunity for curricular overhaul. Key questions for global health educators in this moment are: how do we decolonize global health practice, including education, research, partnerships, healthcare systems, and delivery? How do we transform global health education to explicitly include training on global health equity, anti-racism, and decolonization? How do we promote ethical global health engagement and partnership by centering the voices of our partners? How do we listen to those voices we often don't hear or have willfully ignored for so long? And how do we train others to do so? It's in this context that the GHERD curriculum was born. This was a grassroots initiative created by a team of educators, trainees, and scholars who represent all sides of global health and Indigenous health partnerships. It was designed to explicitly integrate topics of decoloniality into global health training programs. So what is GHERD? GHERD stands for, first of all, Global Health Education. Our target audience is that this was designed for residents, fellows, and attendings, but a lot of it would also be applicable beyond clinical and medical practice. Equity, reflecting on equitable engagement and bidirectional partnership best practices. Anti-racism, reflecting on the power, privilege, and systemic racism in global health and committing to be more anti-racist. And decolonization, reflecting on understanding the history of global health and academics to reimagine a more equitable bidirectional future. GHERD curriculum was put together by a team of many hands representing a diversity of institutions, over 20 institutions involved, as well as 5 nations and 3 Indigenous nations, a large number of trainees, and we came together under the American Academy of Pediatrics to develop this curriculum. And it's been in the works since 2019. Several other endorsing partners came on board, including CUGH. And I'm going to now turn it back over to Dr. Rohl to describe more about GHERD.
Thank you, Dr. Hack. So I have the privilege of getting to share with you guys a little bit about the GHERD content. So GHERD is, at least GHERD 1.0 is going to be made up of 6 modules and then 1 mini module. Next slide, please. We're going to go through each of these modules now and just talk about the content. And then some of the activities we'll get to experience as we go throughout our facilitator training today. So the first module is our introductory module, which really introduces the GHERD principles and language framework and the core critical reflection on equity, anti-racism, and decolonization. We're going to get to experience part of the intersectionality activity in our simulated cases later this afternoon, and then you guys get to experience word soup in about 10 minutes when I stop talking. So we'll go to the next slide. Our next module is really focused around the history of global health and uses case studies from the history of global and public health that illustrate the impact of colonialism, both historically and presently, on health outcomes, and how colonialism also played a huge role in shaping the modern field of global health. This is based largely around the Emory Decolonization webinars. We have some discussion questions. We also have some dueling sugar cases that use malaria as a case study for both research and access to care and equity. And then a podcast about why trainees should care about global health history. Next slide, please. So our most robust module is our Taking GHERD to the Field. And this is centered around how to incorporate GHERD into pre-departure and then training, and then field training and field best practices, especially for trainees that might work or do some clinical training while they are doing their global health elective, and then also focus on debriefing and that concept of how we tell our global health stories and center the voices of our partners. Next slide. So while that is really focused on individuals, this module is focused more on institutions and researchers. So GHERD in partnership is really empowering and encouraging individuals and institutions to implement bidirectional ethical partnerships that provide equitable benefits to all its members. So as you can imagine, again, has some case studies, and then also is really focused around research and how we can incorporate GHERD principles into academics. Next slide, please. We didn't want to only focus globally. We thought it was important to focus also, or at least highlight, the role that colonialism, manifest destiny, and racism have played in United States history, and particularly with focused on local, global, marginalized communities in the United States. So in this module, we have didactic around Indigenous health, and then also some many cases that focused on those marginalized communities. And then also probably our most popular activity that we've highlighted is the community walk, which helps facilitators be able to help learners explore the local history and resources of a particular site. And this could be done at a local site or globally as part of pre-departure training or orientation. Next slide, please. Our mini module is around GHERD and climate justice. It really looks at climate change through a lens of social and intergenerational justice and its impact potentially on global mortality, and then also looks at global health education itself and how sometimes our global health electives are actually really complicit with climate injustice and actions that we can take both as individuals and as institutions to change that. Next slide, please. Our last module, which is actually the one that's still a little bit under development, is really an opportunity to reflect on all of the rest of the GHERD experiences, and then to have concrete action steps that we can take as individual institutions and as a field of how we can implement GHERD principles. All right, and next slide, please. So now we're going to shift a little bit from talking about the contents of GHERD to talking a little bit about how all of you can potentially implement GHERD at your institutions after it is published this summer as an open access resource with the American Academy of Pediatrics. So GHERD, as you might have surmised from my previous slides, is really big. It is going to be made up of over 30 hours of potential educational activities. We do not intend that everyone will implement all GHERD activities, and we see it more as a buffet that with many options that can kind of be customized to meet the learners and the needs of your institution. So as a result, we have created a GHERD implementation guide that will be available with the curriculum package that really helps facilitators like all of you to plan your GHERD implementation. Next slide, please. So one of the first and most important questions for today is who will lead the GHERD sessions? So with the nature of the GHERD content, we think that, facilitator training is really ideal and necessary for implementing GHERD at an institution. So today is actually our first ever pilot facilitator training, and we're going to be exploring our facilitator module for the rest of the day today. We are hoping to implement a train the trainers model with the idea of training people at strategic national and regional global health meetings and education meetings, and then having folks be able to go back to their institution and train others and be able to implement and incorporate GHERD into their global health curriculum. So we do have some other upcoming pilot trainings. If you have friends or colleagues going to the APPD or the AAP NCE. Next slide, please. So after we think about who's going to facilitate the session, you want to think about who's going to participate in the GHERD curriculum at your institution. So as part of the implementation guide, we do have notes specifically for different levels of trainees or how to plan for GHERD sessions with people that are from a variety of global health or different training levels. Next slide, please. So then the important question is, how much time do you have for GHERD? So we have several different suggested time lengths. So we have in the implementation guide, we have sort of a pre-departure or boot camp, which is like 1 to 2 days. We have another option that's more like a 6 to 8 sessions, which could be done over a 2 to 4 week elective or over a semester. And then we also have one that's designed more for like a global health track or pathway in a residency fellowship program or like a global health certificate program at the med school level. Certainly there are other adaptions, but these are just suggestions. If you could go to the next slide. As part of the implementation guide, we will include agendas. So to help facilitators to be able to plan for time limits and then pre-work and other sort of tips of planning your GHERD implementation. Next slide, please. So then we also have resources that sort of provide suggested activities by topics. We also will have an appendix that includes information about ACGME and CUGH competencies, if those are important for your institution. So again, kind of being able to plan what the ideal combination of activities is for your institution. Next slide. The heart, go back one. The heart of the implementation guide will be an interactive PDF, which has each of the modules and then each module's activities, the time duration, the different ways that one could present the activity, whether or not there's pre-work, etc. And then we'll actually be able to click on the activity after you sort of select which one and be able to download all of the facilitator guides and other resources that you would need to have that activity happen at your institution. So this will be included as part of the curriculum package. Next slide, please. All right, so then it's important, and we're going to be talking a little bit about this for the rest of the day, but like where and sort of how are you facilitating GHERD? So it can be done virtually or in person, which of course has never been more relevant. Then it's important to think about utilizing pre-work. Pre-work can be hard for some learners. However, for the intensity of some of these discussions, it can be really nice if learners have some time to do some critical reflection prior to coming into a small group discussion. So small group discussions can be helpful for participation and for the intensity of some of these discussions, but it's important when you're planning your GHERD implementation to also think about power dynamics and psychological safety. For example, when we were piloting one of the activities, we realized that having a division director, a bunch of junior faculty and trainees all in the same small group might really change the content of what that discussion looks like. So thinking through some of that, and we're going to go through a lot more detail about facilitation tips as we go throughout today. Next slide, please. So on this last slide, we hope to have a GHERD facilitator community. We will have a GHERD facilitator listserv, and if you complete your evaluation today and put your email in there, you will be signed up for that when we launch with the AAP this summer. We also, the AAP with a CUGH liaison will have a long-term project advisory committee. So similar, if you're familiar with how the AAP manages helping babies survive or helping babies breathe. So that means that GHERD is going to keep growing and changing and getting edited. And so that is another opportunity to be involved as a facilitator. And then we will early to midsummer, be asking for institutions and programs to join an implementation project, because we hope to be able to collect more evaluation and feedback of GHERD's first year. So I think at this point, we are going to shift towards our small groups for our first activity.
All right, and I'll introduce our first activity. Thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Liz Grothaus. I'm a pediatrician at Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago. Our first activity today that we'll be doing, that Amy mentioned a little bit earlier, is something that we've termed word soup. In creating this GHERD curriculum, we were struck by the sheer volume of terms and words that were used when discussing global health, equity, decolonization, and anti-racism, as well as the historical context of many of the terms that are still used today. As such, we created an activity to help designed to develop and help deepen understanding of these terms. We note kind of as we go through this activity that there are no perfect words to use when discussing a given topic or theme. We also know that languages have limitations, particularly when you're conveying and discussing concepts across various cultures. Different words can have different meanings. We also acknowledge that the preferred words or terms to use while discussing these topics will change over time. In this activity that will be completed in small groups, we'll show sets of words and ask you, as you look through the words, to enter your word associations in the chat. So your first impressions of what these words mean to you. We'll then discuss each set of terms and the associations that you've provided. Before we break into small groups, though, I'd like to open this session with a quote by Dr. Ijeoma Opara, who's one of our CUGH liaisons to GHERD and has been instrumental in helping us create this content. Decolonization has multiple definitions, and that's okay. The complexity of the concept, process, and movement allows it to accommodate multiple definitions, even as its meaning shifts depending on a socio-political positionality of the actor, the positionality of their audience, the actor's geographical and epistemological location, their colonial history, their role inside and outside academia, activism, and politics, and their access to power. It is a colonial construct that everything has to be rigidly defined and have only one definition. The fluidity of decoloniality allows for a multifaceted approach to decolonization, so that various aspects of the colonial mountain could be attacked simultaneously and synchronously, increasing the likelihood of it being successfully leveled. I think it's really important that this highlights kind of the importance of word soup and the fluidity of the definitions of the words that we'll be talking about today. And with that, we will move into our small group.
So we're going to shift on to our next activity. This is a brief one, and then we're going to take a little break. But this activity is really more of the self-reflection. So over the breakout room activity, word soup, I think you got a flavor of the complexity of the language that we use to discuss global health and the type of teaching that we do with our learners. And really an awareness for the level of skill and insight that's necessary to lead conversations and make sure that we're appropriately using terminology. But I'm going to invite us to really think about what it takes to be ready to show up to lead conversations and teaching sessions with our learners on these types of topics around decoloniality. And, you know, I think these types of conversations are critical to ensure that the next generation of learners approaches global health through a decolonized, equity-focused, and anti-racist lens. However, the facilitation of these types of conversations, you know, they do produce necessary and productive discomfort amongst ourselves and our learners. And they also require a great deal of care and skill. And I think if you show up to these conversations unprepared, you can actually risk doing more harm than good. And I think the last thing any of us would want would be to traumatize, otherize, or marginalize some of our learners as we make our way through these conversations. So as facilitators of GHERD activities, it will be your responsibility to ensure the psychological safety of participants and really to center the psychological safety of participants who are from marginalized or non-dominant populations. And facilitators must understand the importance of intersectionality. You need to develop a foundational racial literacy and language proficiency, like we just kind of explored in our last activity. You'll need to be able to aptly manage conversations that become derailed and also be able to use trauma-informed approaches, all while managing your own reactions to the discussion. And so some of us may be already ready to go with this type of thing, but for other people, you know, there may be still some work to do before you're really ready to show up bravely and facilitate these types of discussions. In our experience, potential facilitators of GHERD tend to overestimate their readiness to lead these types of conversations. Maybe just because, you know, you haven't really thought through what could go wrong and really prepared yourself to show up for this type of work. So we're going to invite you to just reflect on a few different elements regarding your skills to facilitate GHERD. And then we'll also think about our institution's readiness to incorporate GHERD. And then we're going to take a quick break. So Rena, you can go to the next slide. So we're going to try using this Mentee Meter. And you can either scan the QR code or go to the website and use a code. I think it's also going to be posted in the chat, direct links to join. So I want you to think about each of these questions. And I'm going to read them out loud as you guys get signed up for the Mentee website. If you're not able to work out the technology, you can always just jot down your answer on a piece of paper or reflect quietly to yourself. But I want you to think about your individual readiness. So how confident are you as a potential GHERD facilitator to, number one, how confident are you in your ability to create a psychologically safe environment for group participants? And that's going to be on a 1 to 5 scale, with 1 being not confident at all, and 5 being the most confident. Okay, and we're going to get into that in the second half of our session. Number 2, how confident are you in applying appropriate terminology around decoloniality, racism, systemic oppression, structural violence, and the legacies of colonialism and neo-colonialism? Hopefully your confidence level may have grown a little bit from the last activity. Number 3, how confident are you in using trauma-informed approach to teaching? Number 4, how confident are you in your ability to manage conflict during your teaching? And so managing conflict between participants, how confident are you to manage power dynamics, both between yourself and participants and between participants? And again, hopefully the Mentee will work. If not, you can just reflect on these questions, but you may need to refresh if you're seeing the wrong screen. I'll give you guys a few minutes to answer those. And if people could give me like a thumbs up with the reaction once you're good. Rena, I'm not sure if you're able to see like how many responses are coming in on your end. Okay, we'll give it just another minute. We're going to share the results so you can, I mean, it's not really, but you can just kind of see how you compare to how your peers responded to these questions. Okay, Rena, would you like to try loading the results? Okay, So this is, I think, the average of everybody who responded. This is really interesting. So I think it shows that overall as a group, we've got some work and learning to do in order to feel like we are well prepared to show up to facilitate these types of questions. And I think this is really insightful because, like I said, in our experience, we have seen people overestimate their readiness to engage in these types of conversations. And as you'll see in our second session, things can go very wrong if you don't know how to adequately manage all of these things during the session. I'm just saying, comment, the conflict and power dynamics facilitation is hard. Yes. Okay, so thank you all for responding to that. Okay, and then let's move on to thinking about how ready our institution is to incorporate GHERD. So you should see a prompt to go to the next question on Mentee. But okay, so now we're gonna shift and think about your institution or organization. I will leave that to you as to whether you wanna think about like your residency program or your department or your entire hospital system or the organization in which you work. But just think about, if you were to propose that you want to bring GHERD into your organization, let's think about to what extent your organization so far has done these things. So how much has your organization previously considered the relevance of GHERD principles to its work and outputs? Number two, how much has your organization provided resources to support engagement in critical conversations around equity, anti-racism, or decolonization? And number three, how much has your organization fostered a culture that allows resistance to change ideas and transformational strategies? How much has your organization been able to engage in sustainable, equitable global health partnerships? And then finally, how much has your organization taken action to become an anti-racist, multicultural organization? And I am going to share a tool in a few minutes that you can ponder, but let's just kind of respond to these questions as they are. I'll give you a few minutes. Okay. And if people can give a thumbs up. Okay, good. Let's go ahead and share the results. Okay, so they're interesting that these actually look a little bit lower than the last set. So it looks like our organizations may not be as ready for this type of transformative learning to be introduced or for it to be supported. So thank you for sharing that perspective. And then we're actually going to transition into a 5-minute break. Rena, if you can go to the next slide. During the break, I'm just going to share one tool that you can ponder. So this is a tool that was put together by Crossroads Ministry on a continuum for an organization to truly become an anti-racist and multicultural organization, and really the changes that it would take to get there along a continuum. So during our break time, you can maybe ponder, like, where do you think your organization is on this spectrum? And I think we will come back at 43 after the hour.
So we wanted to talk about fostering psychological safety in critical conversations. A brief outline for the next 50 minutes, we'll go through what psychological safety is in broad terms and model how it can be presented with your learners. understand its impact using a few interactive moments to learn about your experience, discuss why trauma-informed approach is required for successful implementation of GHERD, and then we'll dig into the components of psychological safety and reflection questions for you to assess yourself as a facilitator and describe some specific skills needed to foster psychological safety. And then Dr. Baum will then go into the dreaded times when conversations get derailed, how to recognize derailment, how to respond to it, and then how to re-rail the conversation. We will end on some common pitfalls and helpful scripts to help keep the conversation going in a psychologically safe way, but still boundary set. Much of our content is from Dr. Isom, and we appreciate her input into providing us with these necessary tools. So psychological safety, organizational behavioral scientist Amy Edmondson at Harvard University describes psychological safety as a shared belief that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking, which means that there's a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. Safety is a basic human need, whether it be physical safety as well as psychological. And experiencing psychological safety allows us to function to our best potential. And it's linked with how we see ourselves, our own accountability, and our team's productivity. So finding that growing edge, as you can see here, is where the learning happens. This is where innovation, creativity, and growth reside. This edge may be different for an individual depending on a variety of situational or contextual or historical factors, inequity being one, and being mindful of that. But this is why creating psychological safety must be intentional, and it is a skill that takes practice. I think some of us who feel a little bit confident in it and feel a little bit at ease with it still have this underlying, like, I need to practice this, I can do better, I can always learn and grow. So with that being said, I'd love to get your experience on psychological safety and what strategies you have used or seen used that you could share with the rest of us. So if you don't mind pulling out your phone again, using the QR code or typing into a URL browser, and feel free to type in experiences that you've had, and they should pop up on the screen for you all to see. Giving ground rules, excellent. Trigger warnings. Setting the meeting norms at the front, like how important that is to start with that. I have not thought about this before, and this is new to me. I'm so glad that you're able to be here and learn and see your opinion on it. Leaders telling vulnerable stories, that is huge. Acknowledging the limitations of my expertise and knowledge. So again, vulnerability. Silence and improvisation techniques. Affinity groups, yes, how do we do that well? Having the group discuss and agree on rules. And I think that's important, is how do you have the group be part of this conversation from the outset? Facilitator humility and including mistakes. The trusting tent. I love the analogy of the trusting tent, but agree, like, how do we all agree that we're here to learn and trust each other, that we're all here to learn? Let's see, starting with an expression of my own. Vulnerability, like giving people an out if they don't wish to share. Yes. Understanding history, acknowledging the complexity of the issue, right? These are hard conversations in GHERD that we're hoping for you to feel comfortable enough sharing. Language of people. And the one-on-one conversation. So how do you build your learning structure where you allow from some small group sharing or one-on-one sharing? Evaluating my own bias, yes, to avoid bringing into the conversation, or even bringing into the conversation and allowing you to share the biases that you've learned and how you're mitigating that yourself. Perfect. Thank you all for providing your experience. And I saw something about zero tolerance of maybe, I think it might have said like explicit issues. And I think that's a really big important part of this. How do you have the permission as a facilitator to say that this is not allowed in this setting? And if it happens, this is our response to it. Thank you all for engaging. I'm going to move on to the next portion. So when someone finds themselves in the danger zone, which means like low psychological safety, there exists a heightened anxiety and trauma. And when you're in this comfort zone, meaning not being presented with enough opportunity to risk take, you may sense some disengagement or apathy. So here are thoughts that I like to share with my group, and I think I'm going to pull some from the group that we had here, but using I statements. I think a big one is also leaders modeling vulnerability, which I heard mentioned a couple times. And I love the concept of step back and step up. Notice the times where you feel like you might be talking more, or you may be an expert in the topic, but you just don't, trying to tell yourself, I'm going to not say as much so I can allow other people to speak in. And then stepping up is something that you're not commonly used to, is talking in large groups, but seeing when you find a time of comfort or willingness to take a risk to try to step up and speak in. I think a big one also is valuing diversity and saying that the more voices, the more perspective is going to have a larger outcome and a larger impact than we can even imagine possible. So really inviting everybody to talk, assuming best intentions that we're here to learn, and not assigning someone's intent without trying to be curious and humble about it. And I especially love the last one, which is believing that everyone is capable of improving, that we're here to learn for a reason, that we're all capable. We're all people who are here to try to broaden our perspectives. And so I think that's important. And as facilitators, we want to prevent learners from feeling ashamed or feeling less productive or feeling like they have low accountability. So it is important to establish and model these type of norms, and then help each member understand what they bring to the team. Make that your kind of goal, is that everyone on this call, everyone in this group, they bring something to the team. So I think that's important. And then also silence is something I think we should acknowledge that it happens. It can be a time to allow learners to embrace discomfort, to sit with a comment, to sit with the concept and embrace what that means to them, to internalize it. Or it could be a place for restoration. So we're asking your learners, feel free to turn off your video, step aside if you need to. If you feel like this is not comfortable and you're in a danger zone, feel free to step away and come back whenever you feel comfortable, or not at all. And that you're there afterwards to continue talking about their experience. It is certainly not an assumed universal agreement. And I think as facilitators, we have to remember that, that we're doing our best to share perspectives and to have a discussion, that we're not always there to find the answer or the cause, but to broaden people's thoughts and express something that they normally wouldn't. Okay, and so a couple slides for interactive sessions. So what are the impacts when psychological safety is compromised? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Loss of trust. Yeah, sharing doesn't happen. We're not productive. Burning out. I think that's an incredibly important point to make out as healthcare professionals. Silence that isn't productive, right? How do we find the courage as facilitators to know when silence is not productive and we need to kind of step in and acknowledge? Disengagement, yes. Fear, trauma, yes. A fear and loss of confidence. Deepened divisions, re-traumatization, disconnect, othering. Learning cannot happen, and compromised safety potentially impacts future learning as well. Yes. Does that mean that this learner may not continue to engage in these conversations? Compounding trauma, skewed results. People are not heard. Defensiveness, right? And sometimes the most valuable perspectives may be left out. A failure on the program's part, or an area that needs to certainly improve and need to be addressed. Losing people from an institution. I think that is the fear of low psychological safety. And so I think we can see that there's that loss of potential to learn as an individual and as a group. And we hope that through teaching facilitators how to tackle this tough aspect of psychological safety and trauma-informed approach is necessary to successful GHERD implementation and outcome improvement. Thank you all. PTSD, loss of agency. Yes, and some of these are just like hitting home for me. So thank you all for sharing. Okay, let's move to the final interactive question. I hope that this comes up okay. So how has psychological safety enhanced your belonging, voice, or opinion? Engagement. Yes, makes me feel more likely to share honestly. Validation, even if others disagreed with what I said, made me brave. Feeling safe to share vulnerably. Not sure I felt that. Yeah, and that's real. And that's real. Thank you for sharing that. I hope that we can improve on that and provide tools. More likely to engage, bring authentic self to everything I do. Promotes listening to others. I have experienced, oops. All safety, and now I'm extremely distrustful and less confident in myself. Feeling safe and share. Thank you for sharing these experiences that you've had, and for those of you who have felt that the impact has been immense, I can share in that as well. And I hope that we can do better collectively as educators across institutions by talking about the importance of psychological safety and using our time and platform to talk about psychological safety before we move into these subtopics. Okay. I appreciate everyone sharing their thoughts. We're going to go ahead and switch to the next topic, which is the 4 R's of trauma-informed facilitation. I think Dr. Brown's going to share the screen once ready. Perfect. So the GHerd curriculum content and engagement requires deep discussions that acknowledge historical and ongoing trauma and risks bringing up trauma. Promoting psychological safety is imperative and requires facilitators to be capable of the 4 R's, which are realize the widespread impact of trauma, recognize how it is impacting the learner, respond in a way to allow the learner to feel heard, facilitate healing from trauma, and resist re-traumatization. Preparing for trauma-informed facilitation requires an understanding of trauma and an awareness of the impact it can have, and strategies for reducing the risk of re-traumatization, which is the primary goal of trauma-informed approach, is avoiding re-traumatization. And I think sharing about our experiences is one way to do it, but also doing the work and learning about how the words that we use matter, what words, how they land differently for different people. And so educating ourselves as facilitators and doing that work is a step towards trauma-informed facilitation. Next slide. And so next we wanted to go over the 4 components of psychological safety, because interpersonal and group dynamics affect psychological safety. So it's critical for facilitators to appreciate these components, which are inclusion safety, learner safety, collaborator safety, and challenger safety. Our facilitation styles should also honor the spaces in which people exist, interact with each other, because societal regard for various social identities has different implications for how people are able to be their authentic selves and how they are received by those around them. Next slide. We'll go into each of the components next. So go ahead, next slide. So inclusion safety. This is the process of creating a working and learning environment that recognizes, appreciates, and effectively utilizes the talents, skills, and perspectives of every learner. So I'm going to go through some reflection questions that you as a facilitator could ask yourself to understand how are you building in these components of safety. So does everyone in your learning environment feel included, valued, and treated fairly, no matter who they are? Next component. Learner safety. So this is learning requires a culture that values a growth mindset and believes in the power of learning from mistakes. This is encouraging learning moments, contributes to personal and group growth, and that is the importance of it. So does your learning environment feel safe to experiment and learn from mistakes? Collaborator safety, and this requires a culture that values input from all learners, no matter their position or title. When learners are able to contribute, they can co-create innovative solutions, big and small problems. So asking yourself, does your learning environment allow for constructive debate and encourage unrestrained engagement? And finally, the challenger safety. So challenging requires a culture that values speaking up and problems in order to improve how the learning environment functions. When challenger safety is present, input from all learners is requested and responded in ways that encourage additional sharing. And I think we want to take that point home, is how can I promote additional sharing despite being challenged, despite going through tough conversations? So does your learning environment feel safe to challenge? So I think these are reflection questions that you can ask yourself before a session or after a session to improve on the next time you do this. And then the last portion is just the skills that are needed as facilitators. So being intentional about noticing exclusionary behaviors of your own or others. So really doing that work about yourself and seeing in real time how it might be happening in the session. And when you are able to cultivate this, you'll see some inclusion safety where ideas and experiences are valued, are openly contributed, and then including others regardless of the position or title, and learners feeling like they're being treated fairly. Another skills to cultivate for inclusion safety is adopting a growth mindset and being compassionate towards others who make mistakes. And this allows in discovery, asking more questions, learning from mistakes, and experimenting and looking for new opportunities. Knowing your communication style, and especially under stress, reflecting back on times when you've been in stressful situations and how your communication was perceived or provided, embracing open-mindedness, and that takes intentional effort. And this allows for collaborator safety, where you'll start to see engagement that's unconstrained, interactions, having mutual access, maintaining open dialogue, and fostering constructive debate. And then lastly, committing to intellectual bravery and being open to challenges to the status quo. This provides challenger safety, and you may see your learners starting to challenge the status quo, exposing problems, speaking up, expressing ideas, and identifying changes. So committing to these are skills that we hope facilitators will gain.
All right, thanks, Dr. Tim. So I'm Dr. Bowen, and with that background, I want to talk with someone about the types of skills. Like once you have those skills for, and it's important to really understand when a conversation is taking a turn for the worse, because the sooner you can identify that, it is to navigate as a facilitator. And so the following are some general categories with some examples of how direct might manifest. Retaliation in the top left corner, it is something that may occur when someone wants to challenge the content of the anti-racist or decolonization message. Examples of this include challenging the intent and may sometimes blend into the ad hominem or personal attacks in the bottom left-hand corner. And so some examples of how that may manifest is, someone asking, oh, come on, don't we have more important things to talk about, suggesting that you have an agenda, or even going into the personal attacks route, saying, oh, you're just easily offended. I don't think you're as marginalized as you claim. Recognizing that those comments may be directed towards you as the facilitator, but oftentimes may be directed towards another participant in the room. Other derailment may occur, attacking a person's unwillingness to educate. So if you look in the top right corner, there are those statements that imply it's someone else's responsibility to teach them, or saying it's not their fault for feeling that way. Like, why won't you teach me? And that's something that as a facilitator, you'll need to address as well. And then other approaches may occur in relation to the emotion of people of color speaking up. They may ascribe someone as angry and therefore not quote unquote rational, helpful, or contributory to the conversation. Other emotions too, in the top right corner, can be used to attack the merit of the message, saying you're being too emotional or overly sensitive, or suggesting that you're taking things too personally. The humor category on the upper left-hand corner is something that signifies when a derailing participant is using the ideas of jokes to really abdicate responsibility, either from themselves or from someone else with a problematic message, saying, oh, it's just a joke, it's just on the internet, it's meaningless. Or no, I'm just playing devil's advocate, haha. Those are some derailment strategies that you may observe. And then the last two, the bottom two, can be particularly challenging, and those are categories of entitlement and distraction. And so entitlement is when someone focuses on their own perspective as if it occurs in a vacuum, suggesting, well, I'm not racist. If those people can use that term, why can't I use it? This happens to me too. That type of response typically needs to be redirected to systemic problems themselves. And then distraction is a broad category of derailment where overall strategies to push the conversation into a tangent, often irrelevant to the point. They can sometimes be inflammatory as well. And so once you identify that, I want to talk about the different frameworks you can use to re-rail the conversation. And so the first is eyes on the prize. This is something that we should all be doing from the start anyway, which is really setting a goal for the conversation. If you are trying to persuade someone of a topic, share a narrative, or stimulate a certain thought, really set a goal for yourself and for those so that you can focus contributions. Calling it what it is, very powerful. It's not, it seems obvious, but it's not something that people are necessarily inclined to do right away. With these types of difficult conversations, sometimes people can feel inclined to sort of beat around the bush, but really explicitly identifying what's happening can be very useful to reorient it. And so that is saying specifically and explicitly, like what you are doing is distracting from the point, or the way you're talking about this is actually derailing from the direction that we're supposed to go with this conversation. Or just saying this is a tangent and it's really taking the focus away from an important topic that I would like to keep discussing. Another type is just let's talk about race. This can be useful if someone is attacking emotions or implying emotions somehow negates the value of the message itself. So one line you can use is say, hey, you know what, can we talk about the subject itself and not the way we about the subject, really focusing on content. For putting it on the agenda, it's very important to make sure that you do come back to it if it is relevant to racism or colonization, and we'll talk about why that's important. But sometimes it is necessary to say, I hear you, and I'm happy to talk about this, but let's finish the initial subject first. Like Dr. Tam alluded to earlier, moments of silence are incredibly powerful and useful, and they're really multifunctional. For one thing, it allows the derailing participant to reflect on why silence is needed in the first place. It gives the vulnerable participants in the room time to take stock of what was said. And importantly, it gives you, the facilitator, the opportunity to decide how you're going to manage the conversation moving forward. And so examples of this are really just saying like, hey, I really want to respond to that, but I need to take a moment to collect my thoughts and feelings because I'm having a number of them. Or this is a hard conversation. I think we should all just sit with that for a second and then use that as an opportunity for that reflection. And then the last two are big ones, really focusing on the systems. Oftentimes if someone is using a distraction or entitlement type of derailment, using it as an opportunity to say, okay, so what I'm hearing you say is that you're not an intentionally racist person. The point is that it's not you, it's everyone when it comes to absorbing racial stereotypes and bias. And then hiding the everyday world of racism is really a way to point out the flaws of taking a colorblind approach to racism, pointing out that this race and colonization are really baked into every facet of society, and that it's a mark of racial literacy, not that you're just constantly thinking about race when you acknowledge that. So then with those frameworks, I want to move on to some tools that we can use, getting a little more concrete. But first I want to talk about what doesn't work as a facilitator, because there are approaches that are very easy to take, but do nothing to push the conversation forward or really teach those anti-racist concepts. So the first is to do nothing, which is probably the path of least resistance in a lot of occasions. And what that is really if someone starts to derail the conversation, allowing all the learners to take over the conversation. And with this, you're exhibiting behavioral and emotional passivity of your own action. And the consequence of that is that it suggests to the learners in the room that you shouldn't even bother trying to talk about this stuff. If they see the leader of the room not truly facilitating it and the conversation digresses, then intrinsically participants will not see that value. Allowing sidetracking conversations is another thing that doesn't work. So allowing a learner to change the topic to a discussion on, say, gender that is critically not intersectional with race on the topic of the discussion. Intersectionality is critical, and there are a lot of occasions where something like that would be relevant. But if it's going on a true tangent, then the result of allowing that to happen is that diversion occurs from the race issue that you were trying to talk about. This is a big one too, because we're all nice people and we really want to make sure that everyone's happy and comfortable and safe. And so one strategy might be to just try and do your best to appease the participants, meaning you're avoiding deep discussions to sort of maintain what you see as harmony in the classroom. This can manifest as like avoiding the confrontation, allowing the sidetracks, pointing out that we have more in common than we are different, and really focusing on like superficial issues without really getting to those deeper personal meetings. The consequence of that is that by trying to maintain that quote unquote harmony, you're actually negating the deeper explorations of all these biases and stereotypes and really deep emotions that are associated with race and racism. And those are important because it's how we push things forward. A couple more. It can be easy to just want to terminate the discussion. If you feel like things are getting out of hand, just like pumping the brakes, saying, I am the facilitator and we're going to stop this right now. Or really giving conditions on how the topic should be discussed. Another example would be tabling it without any intention of returning to it in the first place. Or likewise, just asking them to discuss outside the workshop. And then, telling people to calm down is rarely useful in any situation. And so the consequence of just shutting down the conversation like that is that you've lost an opportunity to really role model conflict resolution. And again, it reinforces the avoidance of these difficult conversations. And then lastly, one thing to keep in mind is that it's very easy to become defensive, especially as a facilitator. You might find yourself feeling like you're being invalidated or your credibility is being assailed. And then it's a very natural instinct for you to get defensive to this. But it's important to try and check if we do become defensive, the learner then deflecting perceived criticism or uncomfortable feelings might actually engage in similar behavior. So with that, let's talk about what actually does work. And then I'll give you some concrete lines to help facilitate the things that do. So first, we have to understand our identities. Understanding your own identities correlates with your ability to be grounded and secure in that critical dialogue. It minimizes self-protection of self-esteem and results in decreased defensiveness, which is that thing that we want to avoid. Next, we have to acknowledge our own biases and be open to admitting them. You know, before facilitating these critical dialogues, we have to have cognitive awareness that cultural conditioning of society produces biases, fears, and stereotypes, which, you know, we as individuals have adopted. And so after acknowledging our own biases, the next step is to be open and publicly admit them, which can be very hard to do. Something else that really helps you is to validate and facilitate discussion of the feelings. So you have to allow space for strong expression of feelings because these are strong emotions. And then you have to create an environment that allows for openness and receptivity to those strong emotions. And then talking about anxieties or anger can really help the participants better understand themselves and others. And so that's really like a useful thing to push these topics forward. So focus on the feelings, address the emotions and not the specifics of the situation. And then, of course, avoid judgmental language. Even if you don't understand the emotional response, your focus is on how it felt for that other person. And then lastly, use probing and curious questions. So really dig into what the emotions actually mean for people. Help them identify them and explore them for the audience. So how do we really like dig into those feelings? One line you can use is to really just explicitly acknowledge them. Say, I can see that you are upset or sad or scared. Summarizing is critical because it's you don't want to be misinterpreting what the participant is saying either. So really using the phrase like, what I am hearing you say is XYZ, or it sounds like you're saying ABC. And if you have it wrong, it'll allow them a chance to correct and clarify. Acknowledge the effort that people are putting in. You can tell them like, look, I can see you are working hard to communicate this emotion, or I can see you're making an effort here. And then using the I and I am thinking statements are very useful. So saying, I'm thinking this must have been difficult for you or sad. And that can help them dig into their feelings as well. And then there are some probing questions that you can use. Really just explicitly invite them to tell you how they felt. Just ask them, how did you feel when this happened or when someone said this? Ask those clarifying questions. So what did you mean when you said XYZ? Likewise, just tell me more about what you meant. And then really trying to identify the feeling and clarify. So, what about this situation makes you feel angry or sad or afraid? By using all of these techniques, you can help people who may be vulnerable in the room feel safe to express their emotions, and hopefully guide everyone else in the room to be receptive to them as well. So with that, how are we doing on time? Perfect. So we can now go into our breakout rooms. And in these rooms, what you'll do is you'll watch some simulated scenarios of facilitation of various GHERD curricula. And the task for you all is to watch for the types of derailment that occur and things that the facilitator did or could have done to sort of get the conversation back on track. There'll be 2 cases demonstrated, each with 2 simulated scenarios, so a total of 4. and have an opportunity to discuss all of them with your small group leaders. So with that, we should be able to.
I am going to share my screen with the evaluation. And I will also post it in the chat. So really that is the end of our content from today's satellite session. We had a lot packed in. I know this was a lot of intense learning. And so you all are welcome to stay or go whenever you need to. We do ask that you complete the evaluation. And this is really important to provide us feedback so that we can continue to improve GHERD in the future. We've got some other facilitator trainings coming up just next month. And so we would like to really immediately include your feedback into improving our next set of facilitator trainings. This was our first time today, so thank you for bearing with us as we kind of piloted this training. But yeah, we really appreciate any feedback that you have. At the end of this SurveyMonkey, there's an opportunity to leave your email address. And if you do so, we will follow up by sending you a preview of the GHERD curriculum before its official launch in this summer. And we'll also keep you updated on when the curriculum is launching. So that would be great if you can complete that. But feel free to stay as long as you'd like. I might invite some people to share reactions from their breakout rooms if you want. But again, it is the end of kind of the planned content for today. How did I see one other breakout room is back? How did your discussion go? DeMarco or Cindy, any reactions from your group?
We had rich discussion, really thoughtful comments, and there were two requests. One was for slides from the whole presentation today, and then also and it was interesting because there was chatter about this in our GHERD app among the presenters, that it would be really helpful for DeMarco's presentation to be sort of placed into terms and made a little bit more concise for future facilitators. But very good response, and we learned a lot, I think, from each other.
Great. Yeah, I do think it would be really handy to have like the didactic stuff that DeMarco and team presented handy to refer to during that second activity. So we'll definitely implement that feedback for future sessions. Any other reactions or questions, comments that people want to share? It's just an open forum.
I have a question. Do you plan to have people take, say, a bias test in real life during the training, or was that just an example of, what this may look like? It will be part of a larger context in which they are prepared to understand what it's about and given tools to handle results they may not like, et cetera, because if you do it on a very short notice, it's possible that you will get the kinds of reactions we saw.
Yeah, Marco, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, so in the modules, it would be in one of the modules, they do undergo the implicit bias tests. And so that is like a very real conversation that may occur as you're facilitating them.
Right. Yeah, so I honestly think that preparing people for results they don't like is probably something really good to do, because I have found them really powerful, and I have found, scores or tests that I was surprised, because I think I have all this cross-cultural blah blah experience, and I was surprised to see some of my biases, and I to encourage people to use it as a tool for growth and for learning, and not, if you react, the best question that you can ask yourself is, why am I reacting so strongly? And you will learn more from that than just tearing the survey apart or deleting the virtual tool, so.
Yeah, no, that's right. And every GHERD module opens, and the facilitator guide has instructions for each module on how to open with the ground rules and setting the learning environment. And with those instructions comes that sort of like warning to the audience, like the point of this is not to feel proud of yourself for how unbiased you are, right? The point is to really highlight like the biases that are so pervasive for all of us.
And welcome back to those who are filtering out of your breakout rooms. We are just having an open forum here. I encourage you to please complete an evaluation. It's to help us improve this facilitator training, and also to leave your contact information so that you can receive curricular materials and updates. But we're just having kind of an open forum to share any final reactions or anything you'd like to discuss with this larger group about how things went in your breakout room.
Heather, one question that we have within our group from Tracy Rabin, that that I think you can answer better than I can. She's very interested in how adaptable this curriculum is to other medical specialties, since we're pediatricians. What about internal medicine? What about nursing? What about public health?
Yeah, that's a great question. So GHERD was developed largely by a group of pediatrician educators, but it's applicable beyond pediatrics, and it's really not very pediatric specific, any of it. That said, we are planning some future adaptations for other fields, including adult medicine, emergency medicine, I know are some of them, surgery as well. Just to add in some nuances for those medical specialties, but absolutely, it's also applicable to other non-clinical fields, including public health or other clinical fields like nursing. And so I think GHERD itself is kind of like Amy described. It's like a buffet of offerings of lots of different activities, and you can pick and choose what works for your setting and your learners. But we definitely have interest in making some specific adaptations for different specialties. I think just thinking like, for example, surgery, I think there's a whole different kind of set of considerations that comes into play for global surgery and mission trips and that type of model of care that's been built into, historically the way global surgery has been run. For emergency medicine, we plan to add some information about responding to humanitarian crises and how you do that while applying GHERD principles. So more to come, but I think what we have is already like highly relevant and adaptable for different types of learners. Tracy, what specialty are you?
Hey, Heather. So So I'm med peds, but I also do a lot of work with nursing, public health, medical students, as well as surgery and emergency medicine. So I just sort of a lot of folks. So
awesome. Yeah. And Ijeoma, one of our facilitators, is also med peds. And then James Hudspeth is internal medicine. So we do have some representation on board. Some of the clinical scenarios were more pediatric focused. We've got these simulated case scenarios, but we made already some adult adaptations. But yeah, I think a lot will be relevant for global nursing too, certainly.
awesome, thank you.
How did, for those in the later facilitator groups that joined later, how did things go in your room? Any participants or facilitator moderators can respond.
I think our group was great and had really amazing conversation. Heather, I think something that you could answer better than I can you talk a little bit about how people can get materials from today's session and next steps after our training today?
Yes, I will definitely talk about that. Let me wait for 45 seconds when everyone else comes back. Otherwise, I might be repeating myself twice in a row. Anything else from your breakout rooms as we wait for the others to join us? Lena or Via, anything you wanted to share from yours?
I thought it went really well. It was just really great to go, like I was saying in our breakout room, it was really great to go between here's a facilitation of the material, but here's also integrating how you can do it and pulling in the nuances of facilitating and teaching it both at the same time. And I think we had some great questions of, wait, so how would you do that? Or can you give me like your way of doing it? And I think it was just really nice to be able to share that amongst our breakout room. And I think it enhanced my understanding of how I could do better. And also just having co-facilitators, watching other people do this work just gives me more confidence to keep doing it and learn more.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think we have most people back now. Welcome to those who are just filtering back from breakout rooms. That is really the end of our planned content for the GHerd Facilitator training today. But we really invite you to give us feedback. I put the link in the chat and it's also shared on the screen here. And with a QR code that you can scan with your phone. This is really for program improvement. We're going to implement your feedback right away because we're going to turn this around and take a facilitator training to the Association of Pediatric Program Directors next month. And so we're really looking for any feedback to improve this. I know I've had a lot of questions today from various breakout rooms about how can you get the materials. So we will be sharing a preview of the curriculum with those who attended today. You can drop your email in the SurveyMonkey, and that's how we'll be able to stay in touch with you to make sure that you get everything. We plan to release kind of a preview of the curriculum. The entire curriculum is going to be launched this summer via the AAP website. But for those who invested the time to attend this training, we're going to be able to share a preview, including some of the activities and slides that we covered today. And then we'll also just be sending out updates as far as when the entire curriculum is launched and available for download. It's going to be open access. I know Amy wanted to also make a concluding comment.
Thank you everyone for coming today. I just wanted to say one thing because it was a great question and it got cut off at the end of my group, but then I realized that probably a lot of our CUGH participants have this question. So no, you do not have to be a pediatrician or a future pediatrician to participate in GHERD. 90% of GHERD is already ready for really public and global health providers across the board. We will have an additional like adult medicine adaptation, and we're also hoping to have some humanitarian and disaster relief in a future edition of GHERD, which might be in about a year or so. But the majority of GHERD is ready to go, regardless of the subspecialty. I think that was my big point. So hopefully that answers people's questions. And you don't have to be a pediatrician or a member of the AAP. It is truly an open access resource, similar to Helping Babies Breathe.
Thanks, Amy. And now it's really just an open forum for you to complete the evaluation, and also happy to entertain any final questions, comments, feedback. We would love to hear whatever you have to say. Also, if any of the small breakout room facilitators would like to share any high points from their breakout rooms, please feel free.
So one plug for the survey that we're asking you to fill out. I make the survey, so please do it for me. But also the evaluation plan for this whole curriculum is different than anything I've ever written before. It's not a knowledge quiz. You can't get all the answers right and get a check mark and a gold star and a certificate that says you've accomplished this. And that's on purpose because we know that it's a continual process, that every time you come back to this curriculum, you learn something more. The more life experiences you have, the more people you listen to, that you're going to grow along this spectrum. And so we don't see it as something to accomplish and something that's going to continually being rewritten and grown and changed as the participants tell us what they want and what they need, and as we listen to more voices.
Thanks, Stephanie.
I also want to give a shout out to the acting and the videos was very good. I believed and felt everything you guys went through, even when you turned the cameras off.
Thank you. We are accepting Oscars nominations for our work. But I think for the videos, the credit really goes to DeMarco. He was the mastermind behind them, scriptwriter, director, and just really artfully integrated some wonderful teaching into some simulated video scenarios. Really lots of creativity and hard work went into this. Some of our spouses and friends were even actors in the video. So we recruited some additional faces to be in our simulated Zoom rooms. And so we will pass that along to them that you liked the acting. Thank you.
Yeah, I gotta give kudos to Whitney Cameron. Every time I watch it, I'm like, I have to cover my reaction because it's so good.
It's definitely a positive benefit to wearing a mask for the past couple of months. Definitely. So thank you guys.
Okay, well, feel free to drop off whenever you need to. I think some of us will just stick around for any final questions that you may have, but we thank you so much for coming and helping us launch GHERD. This was awesome.
Thank you. Thank you. Lovely.